Welcome, Eliza.
All right, somebody flag me if I'm talking too fast. I'm often guilty of that. So I'm so glad to be here in Lisbon, and it has been such a pleasure to spend time with so many of you over the last few days. It's a lot more fun than the time that I've spent buried in the literature on cults and coercive persuasion over the past few years. Today I really wanted to reflect on how many of those dynamics show up in online trans subcultures and how they shape the self-understandings and experiences of adolescents and young adults in these spaces. In particular, I want to focus on three key concepts from the literature on cults and coercive persuasion. These are don't know seekership, radical departures, and bounded choice. Young people who fall into destructive movements and cults are often seekers. As Elaine Barker points out, seekership comes in many different guises. Some people are looking for self-enlightenment, some are seeking revolutionary political change, others spiritual consummation. But there are also people who know that something is missing, but they don't know what. Barker was trying to figure out in her research what distinguished people who joined the Moonies from those who kept their distance or merely drifted in and quickly drifted back out. She surveyed young people about their values and goals and how they pursued them. She wanted to find out what they were looking for. On a hunch, she added a question that said, "I was looking for something, but I didn't know what." She found to her amazement that this was the ideal to which, more than any other, discriminated between the Moonies, the non-joiners, and the control group. She lost count of the number of Moonies who added enthusiastic comments like, "Yes," and the number of confused members of other groups who wrote, "What?" or "Don't understand," or "Bloody silly question" in the margin. The kids who ultimately find gender initially set out looking for all kinds of things, mixing healthy and adaptive needs with unhealthy and maladaptive ones. They're looking for meaning, explanation for why they feel the way that they do, a sense of belonging, a purpose, a cause, direction, distinction, a way to individuate, recognitions for the changes that we all undergo as we grow up, a way forward when healthier pathways are blocked, and the authorization to speak and to seek care from others. They're also looking for things like permission, an excuse or a scapegoat for why things aren't working, a way to act out, and saddest of all, a way to reject themselves and their bodies, a way out of the self. Many trans-identified individuals seem afraid to grow up, as though they worry about their ability to enter the world of adult responsibility. For these people, trans is a cul-de-sac, or maybe it's a cocoon, a substitute for meaningful growth and change. Taken together, this mix of motivations puts many of these kids firmly in the category of, "I was looking for something, but I didn't know what." These young people are ripe for what the psychiatrist Saul Levine called a radical departure, a sharp and sudden break with the life that they once lived. When it comes to radical departures, gender is a particularly attractive offering. There's a supportive community, a chance to rebel, an opportunity to be part of a vanguard on the right side of history. Or I thought Brett Alderman put this particularly nicely when he said, "Gender ideology is such a disastrous vehicle for adolescent angst. It allows for the ultimate reproach. I have been given the wrong body," and it allows for the ultimate rebellion. "I will exchange this body and get a new one." As young people explore gender, they are indoctrinated into new ways of seeing gender that radically alters their beliefs about themselves, their attitudes toward their bodies, and toward extreme body modifications, and their relationships with family, friends, and the offline world. Recruitment takes many forms. Some young people are groomed into a trans identity by predatory adults. Some learn about trans identities in schools that upend kids' basic, commonsensical understanding of sex in the name of inclusivity. Others respond to peer influence, and many self-indoctrinate online. Where they're prompted to question gender and told if you question gender, you're questioning for a reason. You're trans. A trans epiphany is most accurately described as an existential crisis, a revelation that cuts one's life in half. Transition is thus conceptualized as a process of unlearning and relearning everything. Everything you ever thought you knew about who you are, everything you ever thought you knew about human beings, everything you thought you knew about your family. Are they caring and concerned, or are they repressive and transphobic? not to mention learning how to stand and walk in a convincingly masculine or feminine way, figuring out which gestures will give you away and which will uphold the illusion that you're attempting to create. There's a sense in which you are born again when you come out as trans. Not coincidentally, infantilization is rampant in these communities. Men in their 40s revel in their girlhood. Plush toys, anime, and cartoons abound. Every kind of misbehavior can be blamed on going through second puberty, which is, of course, not a thing. This infantilization facilitates the process of resocialization into radical new beliefs and ways of relating to the world. We often talk about children as sponges, soaking up the world for the first time. Anyone who has spent any amount of time hanging out with a small child knows that children can infuse ordinary events with wonder and how open they are to the world around them. There's nothing quite like it. But to be so open and unformed is also to be profoundly vulnerable to manipulation and to distortion. Cults and high-control movements often try to induce this childlike malleability in new members. Initiates, by definition, know nothing. Cults often pair newcomers up with seasoned members, who they often call older siblings. These provide a mix of instruction and surveillance. Cult recruitment activities also facilitate this kind of regression into childhood, like the Moonies did during recruitment weekends packed with juvenile skits and sing-alongs. Transition is packaged as a symbolic form of death and rebirth, complete with dead names and rebirth days. But it's better understood as a comprehensive program of self-rejection that proceeds from one disowning to the next. Your name, your past, your self-understandings, parts of your body, any loved ones who resist, any inner voice that questions. Embracing a new identity and a new set of beliefs about gender provides opportunities for learning and growth and belonging and mastery of new concepts, all of which can be exciting for young people. But tearing down your old identity and beliefs and attachments is painful, and it's profoundly destabilizing. Young people going through this process describe themselves as having been, quote, more functional, productive, and happy before they realized they were trans. They describe racing hearts and obsessive thoughts. Meanwhile, the trans community reassures them that it's normal to fall apart. Upon realizing that you're trans, many young people find themselves paralyzed by obsessive doubts and fears. This is where the famously, or infamously, supportive trans community steps in, ready to celebrate every step, no matter how insignificant, to validate every feeling, no matter how out of touch with reality. And honestly, the more out of touch with reality, the better. One effect of this love bombing is that real-world interactions start to chafe. Maybe nobody notices the changes that you've made. Maybe nobody cares. Maybe they think it's a phase or a manifestation of mental illness. These reactions and non-reactions make your internal transformation feel unreal. It's tempting to retreat further into online spaces. There are no hard questions there. This is something that actually has a funny way of popping up in the research literature on trans-identified kids and their use of online spaces. Look around and you'll find a lot of researchers saying, wow, it's weird, but somehow problematic internet use is bad for every other kind of kid, except trans kids. I think these researchers are missing an obvious explanation. Maybe it's soothing to inhabit a fantasy world online and distressing to exit one. Online, young people can live inside immersive fictions, like the one Kathleen Stack wrote about in Material Girls. Offline, life is messier. Re-entering reality can hurt. At the same time, trans communities set impossible expectations for how your real-world friends, family, and peers, even perfect strangers, ought to react to your gender revelations and presentations. The expectation is that everyone should be able to make the adjustment seamlessly. If they really cared about you, why would they be so attached to your gender? Meanwhile, recruits are sensitized to new sources of distress and threat. I think this is why so many young people pop up asking if it's normal that they feel so much worse after coming out as trans. They're constantly exposed to new ways to feel bad about their bodies. More sinisterly, they're encouraged to believe that they are under serious threat. Steve Hassan referred to this as phobia indoctrination, the process of instilling members of high-control groups with irrational fears that limit their engagement with the outside world and make it hard to question and leave the group. In online trans communities, phobia indoctrination takes many forms. These include telling community members that anyone who questions their identity or the advisability of transition, even if they're coming from a place of genuine care and concern, doesn't accept them for who they really are, or is denying their right to exist. This pushes community members, especially naive young people, to cut themselves off from friends and loved ones who may question or contradict the trans community, or who may simply fail to follow the elaborate and often bizarre protocols that trans communities lead members to expect. Then there's creating the false impression of a trans murder epidemic, even calling it a trans genocide, and telling young people that the implementation of the Cass report is, for example, social murder. This way of thinking binds members to the community and instills an irrational fear of the outside world and of mild-mannered British pediatricians. These communities also inflate suicide risk and present transition as the only alternative to suicide when it comes to dealing with gender dysphoria. This increases the desperation that young people feel to transition and suppresses questions and doubts that they may have. It also pushes patients to conceal comorbidities and other complicating factors in their biographies from their therapists and medical providers. Telling young people that if they don't come out as trans and transition, they're in denial, and they will be living a lie, that they will inevitably realize their mistakes and regret putting off transition, also makes it harder for young people to make informed, calm choices. Vilifying and attacking detransitioners as traitors and existential threats to the community demonstrates to current members exactly what will happen to them if they step out of line, or God forbid, leave. Finally, teaching members to bury their own questions and doubts by labeling uncertainty about gender identity and transition or discomfort with community dynamics as manifestations of internalized transphobia that cause harm not only to you, but to all trans people. That's right, your private thoughts about whether you're really trans or whether transition is really right for you can hurt other trans people. We'll come back to this one. The result is that community members are gripped by irrational fears, including the fear of freely following their own thoughts. They're alienated from the outside world by bizarre protocols and unreasonable expectations. And they're constantly self-policing to avoid running afoul of doctrine. The experience or perception of persecution and rejection solidifies attachments to this group and increases members' sense of the outside world as hostile, a place to which they cannot return. This may sound perverse, but there's also a flip side to phobia indoctrination that comes with a substantial consolation. One detransitioned woman observed that she, quote, misses the constant affirmations, the validation, the sense of community, the feeling that you have to stick together because the other side wants you dead. She said, I feel like part of me getting so deep into those communities as a teenager was a need for rebellion and purpose. As a trans person, you're told that your entire existence is a fight against oppressive systems, and that feels insanely alluring for a teen girl without a place in the world. All along the way, trans activism sets young people up to be rejected by equipping them with impossible demands and unreasonable expectations. As a result, some young people end up distancing or estranging themselves from their families. Online trans communities are incredibly casual about estrangement. Often young people will disclose that a loved one is hesitant about their decision to transition, but will state clearly that this family member is loving, they're just ill-informed, or they just need more time to come to terms with new information. In almost every case, community members will urge the young person to cut off anyone who is not in lockstep support of their transition, saying things like, we love you, we see you, we accept you. Why can't your family? I want to be really clear about this. No healthy, open, supportive community seeks to terrify and control and isolate its members like this. These are the marks of a manipulative group exercising destructive influence over its most vulnerable members, and it doesn't stop there. A common piece of advice offered to newcomers of wavering faith is, quote, to imagine that there are no obstacles to doing what you want. This often takes the form of bizarre thought experiments. If you could push a button and turn into a woman overnight and nobody would notice the change, would you do it? Of course, nothing remotely like this is on offer. No matter how you answer this question, it tells you nothing about whether you are really trans, whatever that means, or whether transition, with its limited offerings, medical complications, and social frictions, makes sense. These spaces also promote extremely casual and dismissive attitudes toward extreme body modifications. Members talk about wanting their bodies to run on E, not T. They urge each other on, saying things like, quote, "You can just go on hormones. It's okay to do what you want with your body. Change happens no matter what. Since your body will naturally change as you age anyway, why not initiate unnatural changes yourself by taking steroids or getting a double mastectomy?" As one user put it, quote, "I don't really think there's anything wrong with being a quote-unquote lifelong medical patient at all, besides bullshit stigma based on nothing. Nature fucks up. When in doubt, just take the next step. Trust the process. Surrender to the process. To avoid regret, follow your quote-unquote embodiment goals. If you don't want breasts and you get them removed, how could you ever regret that, even if you decide down the road that you're not really transmasculine after all? Doubts are met with a mixture of pity, re-education, silence, and hostility. Fellow members will confide that they have shared the same doubts and overcome them, or that they share the same doubts and battle them every day. These reassurances reinforce membership in the group and make it awkward to persist in expressing unacceptable attitudes, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs about trans identity and transition. Transition is presented as the only way out. When young people bring their doubts to online trans communities, their interlocutors have a way of exacerbating their distress, sealing young people in a chamber with only one exit. If a young person rejects his quote-unquote true self by rejecting his trans identity, he is told that the torment that he currently experiences will never abate. At every stage, you will find your doubts turned against you, mobilized as evidence that you're self-hating or inadequately enlightened, that you have a long way to go to overcome your internalized and deeply problematic biases, which harm you and other trans people, even if these are thoughts you entertain in the privacy of your own mind without ever expressing them out loud. Over time, the surveillance and censorship moves from the outside to the inside. If it's threatening to think about something, if thinking something through will cause dissonant thoughts to clash, you won't. You learn to shut down challenging thoughts with ritualized responses, like, "That's my internalized transphobia talking," or "My imposter syndrome is flaring up again." Internalized transphobia in particular is regarded as a form of self-harm, even as an illness of sorts. Sufferers are encouraged to police their thoughts for symptoms of a resurgence of this illness. Meanwhile, trans communities actively discourage the consumption of outside information, particularly when it comes to the touchy subject of detransition. Quote, "A lot of detransition content is fake propaganda, put there specifically to gaslight real trans people into detransitioning. They're saying things specifically formulated to make you doubt yourself. If in doubt, consume more trans content, spend more time with trans people, celebrate trans people, accept yourself." I think much of what is referred to as gender dysphoria is just cognitive dissonance, the painful gap between fantasy and reality. That's why it gets worse with every step that a young person takes toward transition. Along the way, the broken promises of transition become opportunities to reassert and strengthen your faith, even and especially as it is being tested. Each step of transition that fails to deliver the longed-for result provides a dose of disconfirmation, which the community encourages you to overcome by taking the next step, by taking a leap of faith. Recruitment matters, because if you can convince newcomers to take up the same belief system, you can tell yourself that there must be something there to believe in. The contradictory nonsense of the ideology is a source of dissonance and a trap. What you don't understand, you can't question. Trying to make the nonsensical make sense traps people in ideology. I see so many young people trying to solve the ideology, and because they can't make it add up, because they can't disprove the possibility that's been planted in their minds, they can't move on. I suspect this is one of the reasons that trans ensnares so many book-smart kids who set out to master an exciting new set of ideas and find themselves up to their necks in quicksand. Young people at this stage often feel disillusioned, but trapped. They may recognize the ways that the idea of being trans has poisoned their lives, like the young man who wrote that, quote, "All this has done is make me hate myself more than I already did." But they feel like they've gone too far to turn back. At all stages of recruitment and excitement and disillusionment, young people in trans communities experience what the sociologist and someone who had been involved in cults, Janja Lalich, referred to as bounded choice. Eileen Barker described more or less the same process as being, quote, coerced at the level of meaning. Trans communities remove the capacity to choose by removing options and information. For instance, by telling members that there's never a legitimate reason to detransition. Either you were never trans or you chickened out. Either you were unsupported or you're in denial. Not you changed your mind or you decided you didn't want to live that way. This ideology is incredibly hard to break up with. As one young person questioning the decision to transition reflected, when you're told that, quote, avoiding trans people in communities is just denying yourself from finding out your real self, that means when I think about stopping, I feel like it's denial. But many young people do get unstuck and find their way out. They realize that what they hoped for can never be achieved. They decide to make peace with their bodies, rather than continue to wage a war that can never be won. As one detransitioner put it, he came to realize that, quote, deep introspection tells you nothing. You can spend weeks diving into your subconscious, turning things over and over in your head, and trying to figure out, what did that mean? What did I really feel? But you're chasing a shadow. There's nothing there. It's like staring into the darkness so long that you start to hallucinate. It's scary, but that doesn't mean it's real. I really can't think of a better analogy for what people enthralled to gender are experiencing, staring into the darkness so long that you start to hallucinate. This set of beliefs about the self is inherently distressing. Take this belief system on board and you can never disprove it. You can't rack your brain and find a definitive answer, yes or no. You can't come to a clean resolution, because it's nonsense. Because there is no there, only hallucinations in the dark. The only thing that you can do with nonsense is reject it. And if you cannot reject it, you will run into all kinds of trouble. I've often been asked if I think that the trans community is a cult. I've spent years tinkering with theories about how cult-like dynamics may be emergent properties of online spaces, and ideas about how the internet can spawn leaderless cults. But you don't have to agree with me to recognize that an open, healthy, supportive trans community would not look or sound anything like the trans community that we've got. It would be honest about the risks that trans people face, rather than wildly inflating those risks to instill fear. It would foster resilience and self-sufficiency in gender-questioning youth, rather than telling kids that anyone who disagrees with their worldview hates them, or that exposure to misgendering or dead naming can lead to suicide. A healthy, open, and supportive trans community would accept that transition doesn't work for everybody, and that there are legitimate reasons to detransition and exit the community. A healthy, open, and supportive community wouldn't seek to drive a wedge between gender-questioning youth and family members or friends who sincerely want the best for them, but question whether transition is the right answer. A healthy, open, and supportive trans community would invite ethical research into transition outcomes and alternatives, rather than trying to shut down inquiry. Because trans-identifying people deserve high-quality care, not just ideologically compliant care. And a healthy, open, supportive trans community would encourage young people to explore their questions and doubts openly, recognizing transition as a serious undertaking, without fear of censure or expulsion from the group. So maybe it doesn't matter what we call it, as long as we can see this movement for what it is. That being said, I wanted to end on a positive note. In the 60s and 70s, droves of young people disappeared into cults, ranging from the destructive to the merely bizarre. Many took on new identities, embraced rigid beliefs, and cut contact with loved ones. But Saul Levine found that for most, these new beliefs and practices didn't stick. As he followed these young people over time, he saw that they found ways to reconnect with the questions and doubts that they had previously cast out and disavowed. As he put it, that members could now allow the battle to move indoors, so to speak, which indicates that the structure to contain conflict has been fortified. Ultimately, he concluded that most young people are, quote, able to use their radical departures in the service of growing up. While we wish that young people wrapped up in gender had found a safer and saner way to get unstuck in life, and while we must push back against a medical system that is dangerously interfering in the imaginings and the attempts to find a solution that young people are seizing onto, let us hope that these young people, too, will be able to leave these rigid beliefs behind, think freely, reconnect with their bodies and their families, and move forward. Thank you.
Is it switched on? Yeah, okay. Thank you, that's really fascinating. The thing I'm sitting here trying to think, though, is I cannot think of a single case in history when a cult has been actually mainstream. Mm-hmm. And so while I can understand what you're saying in terms of a youth culture, resonates and is familiar, I can't think of a single, when you were a punk rocker, you didn't go to your doctor, and your doctor then also affirmed the fact that punk was the coolest thing ever and directed you towards how you could take that up a level. Your school teacher didn't sort of affirm your punk rockerness. There was a sort of, I can't think of a single cult that ever had achieved that kind of mainstreaming. So, but however, there's the quote that you had there, which was about from a young person saying there's nothing wrong with being lifelong ill.
Yes.
Sick forever. And in that sense, I think it's got much more in common with the general mental health phenomenon, which is of a vocabulary of anxiety and depression, etc., and numerous disorders, which I think for a lot of younger people, they don't see trans as much different to that. It's just the particular pathway of some that child takes as opposed to another one. Yeah. And again, that's something that is coming from the top down and it hasn't really got any kind of bottom-up dynamic. But I can also see the appeal of it to young people as a sort of formative set of ideas that it feels like it helps them make the transition to adulthood. So I just wondered whether you can think of any example, of a cult that's become so mainstream.
Yeah, I don't think that there are good historical parallels. You can find bits and pieces, all kinds of places, like, I would say the Satanic Panic had a certain amount of buy-in within, the psychotherapy and psychiatric professions, and we saw the validation of beliefs that were, in most cases, in most cases unfounded and were very destructive for people to adopt. And that was not, as far as I know, something that we were teaching to kids in schools and enforcing through hate speech laws and things like that. So I do think that we're in uncharted territory in that sense. And I also see very much the parallels with other kind of labeling with other health and psychiatric issues. And when I have looked at those communities, I see many of the same dynamics in play, actually. It's just not quite as striking in terms of the buy-in of the rest of society, and the heavy consequences for young people are not quite as visible when you're talking about things like the other medicalized identities that young people are adopting online.
Inken Pohl, Religious Studies, Heidelberg University. Thank you very much, Eliza. That was wonderful, as always. I have the same question, and when we talk about destructive religious movements, then we always have a leader or some inner circle. So I'm wondering, who is the inner circle or the leader in the case of trans?
Yeah, so this is the theory about kind of leaderless, cult-like movements as an emergent property of online communities that I've been working on, and I just haven't been able to totally put it together because, there's a lot going on. I do think that ideology, especially the way that ideology evolves online, can serve many of the functions that a leader would serve in a traditional cult. It has the same kind of arbitrariness and the constant movement in terms of what the party line is. And maybe you don't need a leader to achieve many of those same course of dynamics when you're online.